Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Captain Patriotic. I hope everybody's doing well today. So, in honor of President's Day, I thought it would be interesting to take a step back and analyze some more backstories of our U.S. presidents, specifically those who have served in our armed forces throughout our country's history. Now, you can go back and look up the statistics and everything, but roughly two-thirds of the men that have served as U.S. president throughout our country's history have served in some capacity in our nation's armed forces. So today, I'd like to take a deep dive into the backstory and military service of some of the great men that have served as U.S. president. So, without further ado, I'm going to take us way, way back and start from the very beginning, the American Revolutionary War of 1775 through 1783. And as you could probably guess, the first person on this list and is among the faces of the American Revolution is none other than our first president, George Washington. Not only did Washington serve as our nation's first president from 1789 through 1797, he was an essential figure in the victories of the American Revolution throughout many various battles. And what you may not realize is he's had a very long military career since way before we became a nation in the 1770s. In fact, it is noted that as a young colonist, the future U.S. president was known to have had some natural leadership skills that would allow him to rise through the ranks of the then Virginia militia. In fact, by the time he was 23, Washington was commander of all Virginia troops in the territory. Fast forward 20 years later to whenever the Revolutionary War broke out, where when that happened, he was eventually appointed as Major General and Commander in Chief of the Continental Army for the duration of the war from 1775 through 1783. And he served in a number of crucial battles throughout the Revolutionary War. There's so many to list, but his battle record is stellar, to say the very least. So, whenever America defeated the British in 1783, it was an unanimous decision that he would become the new nation's first elected president, and he was widely respected for his part. I mean, he went well and above the call of duty to set the foundation for the country that we know of today. So there you go, guys. George Washington was an American Revolutionary War hero in numerous, numerous battles, including the battle at Trenton, as well as many other battles, to say the very least. Now, the next notable president to serve in the military during this time was none other than the third U.S. president, Thomas Jefferson, who served in office from 1801 through 1809. And I know a lot of us may have heard of Thomas Jefferson in history class, and he's obviously most famous for drafting the Declaration of Independence, or I should say, he was one of the more notable authors of the Declaration of Independence. Roughly 9 years of his pre-presidential life was spent serving our nation's military. He was a colonel in the Virginia militia at the start of the Revolutionary War in 1775. He actually started serving in 1770 and would go on to serve through the middle part of the war in 1779. Now, the next president to serve in the Revolutionary War was none other than James Madison, who served as president from 1909 through 1817 after Jefferson. Very much like his predecessor, Madison also served as a colonel in the Virginia militia from the onset of the war in 1775 through 1781. However, Madison was known to be a very sickly man, mind you, and thus, because of his poor health, he was never allowed to see battle for himself during the American Revolution. However, his role as a leader during the conflict propelled him to many political successes in his home state of Virginia, which would basically pave the way for him to become president later on down the road. Now, the next founding father and president to serve during the Revolutionary War was James Monroe, who served as president from 1817 through 1825. This founding father served in the Continental Army from 1775 until 1778 as a major. In fact, he performed many acts of heroism during his time in the Continental Army. James Monroe nearly died during the Battle of Trenton in 1776 after suffering a severed artery from being bayoneted by a British soldier. Now, God must have been on his side because he actually survived that encounter, and his bravery earned him a promotion to captain, which was bestowed on him by future President George Washington. Now, after recovering from various injuries during the conflict, Monroe gathered his own company of soldiers in Virginia during the Revolution, where he would later be commissioned as a lieutenant colonel in the Continental Army. Talk about a stellar track record for such a very short time period, to say the very least. Now that we've talked about our Revolutionary War presidential veterans, it's time to transition into other conflicts during the early history of the United States, which proudly brings me to our next president that served boldly in our armed forces, Andrew Jackson, who served as the seventh president from 1829 until 1837. Andrew Jackson is a complex figure, and he did a bunch of infamous as well as other things in office that would go down in history with his legacy in office. However, that is not to detract from his stellar military record for the United States, because he had such an astounding career in the U.S. Army in the early years of the Republic. In fact, by the time he retired from the military, he had the rank of Major General, where he first of all served with the U.S. Volunteer Army and then the Tennessee Militia in his early years. In fact, he was appointed Major General of the Tennessee Militia, his home state, in 1802, despite not having any formal military combat experience at that particular point. He was just beloved as a general and really looked out for his men. So this promotion was very well received, and it was a huge honor. Now, it's duly noted that the height of his army career was actually for his service during the infamous War of 1812 with the British, where he was promoted to Major General, and he was most famous for leading a charge in a battle in New Orleans against the British in 1814. Now, you can go on and read more about that particular battle, but he was very, very well known for being basically a highly encourager of his men, even during the heat of battle. In fact, because of his heroism and tough attitude, he would receive the nickname of Old Hickory from his troops that he served with because of his toughness on the battlefield. Now, this nickname would spur him to political popularity after the War of 1812. Very, very iconic figure in American history, to say the very least. Now, the next notable president to serve his country was none other than the ninth president, William Henry Harrison. This is kind of a controversial pick in a way because even though William Henry Harrison by now is best remembered as being the shortest serving president after serving just a mere 31 days into his term, his military experience was quite spectacular, to say the least. Now, he served, like Andrew Jackson, in the War of 1812 from the onset of the war in 1812 until 1814. Now, after a short stint as a major general of the Kentucky militia during the war, he would go on to command the Army of the Northwest Territory that the U.S. just annexed prior. Now, this was kind of a short move on his part, but Harrison ultimately resigned from the Army in 1814, but was later awarded a gold medal for his victories in various battles during the War of 1812. The next president after Harrison to serve with great pride for his country was none other than Zachary Taylor, who served as president from 1849 until his untimely death in 1850. Now, Zachary Taylor basically was a military man from the very beginning. In fact, he actually had a career in the military starting from a very young age of 23 or 24 and had a stellar U.S. Army career of over 40 years when he served from 1808 until 1849. He quickly rose through the ranks, fighting in many different conflicts, including the infamous War of 1812, the Black Hawk War of 1832, the Second Seminole or Florida War from 1835 until 1842, as well as the Mexican American War of 1846 through 1848, which gave us the territories for modern day Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and other states out there in the Southwest and the western part of the country. He was probably most famous for his role in the Mexican American War. And under the leadership of the President Commander in Chief, Taylor rose to become a major general in the U.S. Army during that conflict. And once hostilities ended in 1848, the country basically held him as a national hero and thus elected him as president shortly thereafter. Very, very stellar career at that time. I mean, if you think of modern generals, this guy was almost the equivalent of Dwight Eisenhower, Douglas MacArthur, heck, even George Patton of his day, basically. That is a very stellar career of serving in 4 conflicts for your country. That is impressive, you guys. Now, the next president to serve his country during this early period of our nation's history was actually Franklin Pierce, who served as president from 1853 until 1857. And like a lot of his predecessors, Pierce also served in the Mexican American War of 1846 through 1848. Now, he entered the Army as a private and would go on to recruit other men for the cause in his New Hampshire home, while inevitably becoming an officer in the New Hampshire militia. In fact, in 1847, Pierce would become a brigadier general, where he would win victories in Mexico City and other notable battles during the Mexican American War. And it's duly noted that after being thrown off of his horse, an injury ultimately caused him to miss the Army's final victory at the famous Battle of Guadalupe, although he was already a hero in his right mind at that point because he already distinguished himself heavily. And thus, after the war ended, he would return to his home in New Hampshire and pursue a run for president a few years later. The next president after Franklin Pierce is kind of a controversial pick because James Buchanan, who was basically the president that set the stage for the American Civil War, and by on many accounts, he is considered one of, if not among the worst presidents that have ever served in our nation's history. He was the last president to be a veteran of the War of 1812 and is noted to be the only U.S. president with military experience for which he was not an officer in the military. In fact, he served as a lowly private in the Pennsylvania militia in 1814 during the British invasion of Maryland during the war, being discharged slowly thereafter. Now, which brings me to perhaps one of the most famous presidents that we have ever heard of in history, and arguably one of the best, if not the best president to serve our country in a crucial part in U.S. history, Abraham Lincoln. As we all know, Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president, served from 1861 until 1865 as the crucial leader that would lead the states through the pivotal American Civil War that was brewing at that time. And although he is most famous for his leadership during the Civil War and for signing the Emancipation Proclamation, what you may not know is that Abraham Lincoln actually served in the military for a short time before becoming the famous president that we all know to this day. He actually served in the little known war known as the Black Hawk War, which is basically a war in 1832 where the U.S. forces were fighting against some rogue Indian nations during the area of Illinois and Indiana for this day. Now, during that particular conflict in 1832, he served as a militia captain in the Illinois militia, seeing actual combat against these rogue Indian tribes in that part of the country. Not only was he a stellar U.S. president and he served his country when his country really needed him to during the Civil War, but he bravely put his life on the line much earlier when he was a young man. That to me is exemplary as far as a role model for the country is concerned. I got to give him plenty of props for that, to say the least. Abraham Lincoln's successor after his infamous assassination in April of 1865, Andrew Johnson, also had a bunch of military history behind him, but this is the time period where we're starting to have presidents that have served as veterans in the American Civil War of the 1860s. And although Andrew Johnson, who served from 1865 until 1869, is ranked among the worst presidents in American history for his opposition to the Reconstruction efforts after the war, he was actually, ironically, appointed to the role of military governor for Tennessee by Abraham Lincoln in 1862, where he served as a brigadier general in the U.S. Army until the end of the war in 1865, because Tennessee was part of the South and the Confederates. Lincoln wanted him down there to basically keep the peace and make sure that there was not a bunch of revolutions against other Union members and the country as a general. But anyway, he served in with distinction during the Civil War from 1862 until 1865. Now, after Andrew Johnson leaves office in 1869, we transition to another famous Civil War veteran that we probably at least heard of a little bit in history class, Ulysses S. Grant. Now, he was a very, very popular general during the Civil War for the Union, the North. And not only did he have a stellar stint as U.S. president from 1869 until 1877, he was widely acclaimed on the battlefield for sure. In fact, as a West Point graduate, Grant was the first of three U.S. presidents to attend a U.S. service academy. Although he did not excel as a student in school and planned to leave the military after serving the mandatory 4 years of duty, ultimately he changed his mind as a young man after serving during the Mexican American War, where he basically decided to make a career out of the Army. With his experience in that conflict, Grant would go on to become one of the most influential military figures and leaders during the Civil War, where he proudly led the Union to victory in 1865 and even would go on to negotiate the peace terms at the end of the Civil War. So, after the hostilities ended from the Civil War in 1865, he would go on to serve as a general in the U.S. Army from 1866 until becoming U.S. President in 1869. He had well over 20 years of military service at that particular point and was very much looked upon by many Americans, to say the least. Now, the next president after Ulysses S. Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, who served as president from 1877 until 1881, kind of right at the tail end of the Reconstruction era. He was a Civil War veteran too, and much like Grant, he fought for the Union Army from the duration of the war from 1861 until 1865, where he attained the rank of Major General. And while on active duty during the war, he was elected to Congress despite refusing to campaign for the position. He was not as well known as Grant, but he was an influential military leader in his own right, to say the least. Now, Hayes's successor and the next president on our list, James A. Garfield, was also a notable Civil War veteran. In fact, when he was a young man, Garfield entered the U.S. Army in 1861, fighting for the North, where he served eventually as a lieutenant colonel during the early part of the Civil War. In fact, he was such an influential and such an accomplished officer during the conflict that by 1863, he was made a major general, which at that time, he was the youngest officer to hold that position at that time during the conflict. That's a very big accomplishment in himself. And although he was a very accomplished Army officer, he would go on to resign from military service in December of 1863 in order to take a seat in the House of Representatives, despite him never really campaigning for that position. James A. Garfield is famous for a whole nother reason, and it's quite a sad one, too. President Garfield only served as president for a little bit of 1881, and that's because at this point in history, He was the second U.S. president to be assassinated in office. In fact, it's a kind of complicated as far as how he was treated for his wounds and all of that. But make a long story short, James A. Garfield was trying to board a train for his home in New Jersey whenever he was shot in the back by someone that was seeking a political position and was actually promised it once Garfield became president, but never was. But despite having a relatively, although still bad, gunshot wound to the back, he was not treated very well. In fact, the doctors were known for probing and going after the bullet that was lodged in his back over the next couple of months, to where a lot of people now say he became septic and would die from improper medical treatment at that time. So he died really young at 49 from that gunshot wound. But anyway, James Garfield, before that time in history, was another notable Civil War veteran. Now, upon Garfield's death, his successor that took over the office in his place was Chester A. Arthur, who served from the later half of 1881 until 1885. Arthur's military services spans from just before the Civil War in 1858 until 1863, where he eventually reached the rank of brigadier general in the Army. Now, during the Civil War, he served with the New York militia, but he never fought in a battlefield position himself, although he did see some combat. And that was because he had family ties with members of the Confederacy. So it was kind of a complicated situation to say the least, although he did technically serve his country. Now, the next president after Arthur to serve his country would be Benjamin Harrison, who served as president from 1889 until 1893. You may be thinking, Harrison, that name sounds awfully familiar, and you would be correct to assume that because Benjamin Harrison was actually the grandson of William Henry Harrison, who we talked about earlier in this video. That's right. As far as I'm concerned, William Henry Harrison and Benjamin Harrison are the only grandfather and grandson pair to serve in the White House. That's pretty unique in itself, you guys. That's awesome. As far as Benjamin Harrison's military history is concerned, he followed in his granddad's footsteps by serving in the U.S. Army during the Civil War. Now, he fought for the Union from 1862 until 1865 and recruited many Army volunteers in his home state of Indiana, where he saw plenty of combat with the Union during various battles for the North. Abraham Lincoln himself nominated Harrison to be the rank of Brigadier General of Volunteers for Indiana in 1865. That's pretty stellar, you guys. And although Benjamin Harrison today is probably not one of the more famous presidents to have ever served as in the White House, he's definitely served with distinction during the Civil War, and his praises by many people, including Lincoln, were well deserved. Which brings me to my final president for this particular video, and our final Civil War veteran to serve as president, William McKinley, who served in the White House from 1897 until 1901. McKinley was really young whenever the Civil War broke out in 1861. In fact, he was only 18 at that time, but like his friends, he felt the need to be called up to serve his country. In fact, he would go on to enlist in the Union Army in 1861 and was served for the duration of the Civil War until 1865. And he would go on to reach the rank of, like a couple other presidents on this list, of brevet major before the end of the war, and thus resigned from the Army upon its conclusion. It's not really noted how many significant battles McKinley participated in, but what is greatly noted, though, is that McKinley was definitely well liked among his peers and his comrades, which also helped him gain popularity in office and his whole political career, honestly, after the war ended. That much is noted. Now, William McKinley, if you guys are not super familiar with his history and his impact on the White House, he was the president that helped serve the country during the turn of the 20th century. He was noted because he was trying as best as he could to keep the country together, especially after the Panic of 1893, as well as during the onset of the Spanish American War of 1898. He did a bunch of things in his time in office, and in fact, he was so well liked that he was elected for a second term of office after the election of 1900. However, that term in office was cut very short because he would become the third U.S. president to be assassinated while in office. Yeah, it's a very sad story, but ultimately, he would pass away from a gunshot wound that he sustained after attending the World's Fair in 1901. Medical advances were certainly better at that point than they were for Lincoln or Garfield. Where he was shot was in a critical area, and he ultimately would succumb to his wounds. It's a very infamous story, you guys, but definitely look it up, to say the least. So there you have it, guys. This is part one of our veteran presidents series, and if you stick around for next time, I will go into much more detail about presidents that have served in more modern conflicts, starting with World War One and even some lesser known conflicts at the turn of the 20th century until the present. I mean, these stories of bravery by the men who served as president, to me, are just very intriguing and very insightful, you guys. I don't know about y'all, but I love personal stories of bravery like this, especially from the men who have served the highest seat in our nation's government. So, you guys, if you really like this content, please leave a like and subscribe, and certainly stick around for part two of our veteran U.S. presidents video. Happy President's Day, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.